So let's start by setting our motivation. Developing those minds of confidence, refuge, bodhicitta. All right. So does anyone want to address anything from last class or this topic from prior material? So we're still then on the section where Lama Zopa is explaining the advantages of remembering impermanence and death. So we're on day 94. And I don't know what struck me about the next couple contemplations, particularly was that it seemed almost like, instead of remembering, it seemed almost like Lama Zopa was saying, like a realization, because the benefits that he's talking about here are so incredibly powerful. Maybe for him, he just has to remember, but maybe so it seemed like, because to remember based on the limited amount of meditation, and of course that's the best we can do up until, but the point of studying the Lamrim, the point of meditating on the Lamrim, is to eventually get an actual realization of all of the Lamrim topics. And so there's a difference in my mind. To me, there's a difference between having read some, having meditated some, and then doing your best, as as we're all doing, as is the only thing we can do, to recollect throughout the day, about what we've studied, about what we've meditated on. But the strength of these benefits, to me, it kind of seemed like, I haven't seen the full strength of these benefits. And so I wondered, if that was because really it's kind of referencing a deeper realization that's required, and then you just sort of recollect. So I'm not sure, but because these benefits are intense, because he says, remembering impermanence and death, the minds of attachment, anger, and ignorance, which cause the lower realms, evaporate like morning dew. Um, so, and then he talks about, in a way too, this strikes me, because he said, when he says Dharma practitioner versus worldly person and the difference between them, he's saying that a Dharma practitioner has the means to control, and that's kind of what we talked about last time when the concept of fear arose. One of the things that we talked about was being able to rely on our practice to set up the causes and conditions that would protect us at the time of death, and being able to take a sense of solace, in that, or a sense of comfort in the power of our practice. And that's what he's talking about here, where for a worldly, here he means a worldly person is someone without a spiritual practice, and a Dharma practitioner is someone with a spiritual practice. And how for a worldly person, so worldly doesn't mean like travels a lot or understands. It means like wrapped up in the external environment, seeking rather than being an inner being an outer being, really expecting external causes and conditions to provide for one's happiness and contentment, and sense of ease and peace and all of that, rather than cultivating the internal states of mind that reliably lead to those results. Um, but he's saying a person who does, is externally focused, um, is terrified of death because, as we talked about before, it's a complete unknown. We feel like it's entirely out of our control, whereas a practitioner is doing all of the right things in general. They're learning. So here, I also wondered um, if by practitioner he meant someone who has mastered the small scope, um, because that's really, from a Buddhist perspective, a person who hasn't mastered the small scope isn't a Buddhist, isn't a practitioner. They're considered to be a worldly. You're really considered to be a worldly person until you've accomplished the small scope. And there's yet more contemplations in the small scope. There's karma, fear of the lower realms. So I wondered if, because just remembering impermanence and death, that really isn't, because it really is karma and its effects, and guarding karma that protect us. And we haven't even gotten to that in even the small scope yet. So I kind of also wondered if by Dharma practitioner he meant someone who's really got a handle on the small scope as a whole, because that's really the entryway into someone who cares more about future lives than they do, which is what we've kept coming back to with regard to the small scope. Someone who really is focused on future lives rather than the content of the remainder of this life is a spiritual practitioner from the Buddhist point of view. And if you're not that, you're still working on becoming a Dharma practitioner. So, that's what I'm still working on becoming. And that's probably what all of us are, we're still trying to get to the point where what happens after death is something that we think more about and care more about than what happens today, what happens tomorrow, what happens with my level of, my career and my level of comfort and so on. Um, but he's saying that when you are a Dharma practitioner, you do have the means to ensure not just a good rebirth, but another perfect human rebirth, the best possible rebirth to progress toward enlightenment. And then he's saying that this reorientation that occurs between a worldly person and a Dharma practitioner is that a worldly person has, he says, limitless time for the meaningless affairs of this life and no time for the Dharma. But a Dharma practitioner, it's the other way around. They make time to study, meditate, and do retreat, and the meaningless things have no interest. They don't they don't go to the they don't spend thousands of dollars to go to the Super Bowl and all kinds of things that we think are what we should spend our time doing. Um, so
So if I can get that, so you said that a great practitioner is someone who doesn't think about this life, but only thinks about the next rebirth. Is that correct?
Well, no, a Dharma practitioner. So not necessarily, because a great Dharma practitioner would be someone who's, potentially close to achieving enlightenment in one lifetime. Um, so just the sort of base definition of a Dharma, of a person practicing Dharma, is a person who thinks more about and is more concerned about future lives than the remainder of this life. That's sort of the bar to entry to be considered a Dharma practitioner.
That's really interesting. I have to keep forgetting about what is going to happen in the future and remind myself to be in the present more often than not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think it's about doing in the present. I think it's about understanding, just like, you don't necessarily, when you save money for retirement, or um, you try to be healthy, you don't necessarily like obsess over, oh, in 40 years it could be this disease or that disease, or I might end up in this old folks home or that. But you just sort of have this understanding that the causes and the conditions that I'm creating now will be able to serve a valid and useful purpose at at the right time in the future. Um, so it's not like we obsess about, is it going to be this, is it going to be that, but it's just day by day. Am I doing, just like you would think, am I wasting my money? Am I putting enough aside? You know, am I looking after my physical well-being? You just kind of check. It's just it's a day by day kind of a thing. But all of those days, when they add up, then at the end of that, then you have a comfortable retirement. Then your body is in good shape, rather than kind of letting it fall apart. So I think it's the momentary habits and tendencies that we're laying down every day. But we do it with an understanding that, that there's a long-term view, that there's um, because saving a portion of your salary every week doesn't make sense if you don't have a long-term perspective. You'd be like, well, why just spend it all right now, and um, so we do things with that sort of long-term perspective, and I think Buddhism is kind of just one of those things that we do with that long-term perspective, um, rather than, because when he says worldly, he means, um, not, if you need a new roof, it doesn't mean that, you're just like, oh well, I'll just, allow the roof to collapse, or so it isn't about neglecting the tasks that need to get done in the context of our lives, but not giving them so much influence, not getting wrapped up in being like, oh, what color is the roof going to be, or you know this roof is maybe 6 months, has a 6-month warranty that's longer than that roof. Then, just like, do pick one that's good enough and just get over, kind of be done with it, rather than thinking, oh, it could be like this, or it could be like that, or um, so it's just sort of about doing, certainly doing what we need to do, but not giving it an over inflated sense of importance. And certainly there's many things that serve no real, purpose. like just endless entertainment. And of course, if we're stressed out, we know we talked about some of that before. We may not be in a place where we can totally give up, music or movies or as a source of stress reduction, and you know, um, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. It's just maybe to begin to experiment with, oh, this is what I have done, and this is what is I'm being kind of led in my mind, just due to force of previous habit. I used to, or I have a tendency to respond to stress with this. What if I responded to stress with this? Um, like a 10-minute breathing meditation, or um, something that was less, whether maybe you're not also getting imprints of, violence, or, other things that might be in the entertainment that we gravitate toward. Um,
Thank you.
he says, when our relationship goes wrong, our most cherished possession is stolen, or we lose our job, when something big happens that previously would have caused us to completely lose our mind and maybe even contemplate suicide, we now remember impermanence and death and see that there's no point in being attached. The situation is there, but the minds of attachment and anger through which we view that situation are the real cause of suffering, the cause for rebirth in the lower realms. Remembering impermanence and death, we see how silly we are, and the negative mind that would have normally arisen vanishes. In just that second, we save ourselves from the lower realms. So again, it just kind of struck me that that's a very kind of uh, admirable way of putting things into practice that I think isn't, doesn't not necessarily there from the very beginning, but we move in that direction. And certainly, um, like with all of these antidotes, the issue is, that they it works for a time, um, at least. So, to whatever degree we can bring it up in that moment, there is some, it has a knock on, a follow on effect for a period of time. And then, attachment and anger, all of these things, they come rushing back later on. Um, so that's why we said, you kind of have to keep coming back again and again and again to these contemplations, because it's really, wisdom realizing emptiness that is the ultimate antidote. These are sort of the more conventional antidotes that are useful in the moment in various ways. But uh, okay. So day 95 is again just going continuing to um, help us understand the advantages. He's saying that the thought of death. So here he's talking about what we've brought up before, the role of introspective awareness in the arising of delusions, and how that's such an important tool to develop with any of the delusions. Because here he's saying um, that the quote is, remembering impermanence and death um, uh, is like a hammer that can destroy all of our delusions in one hit. So he's saying that this is something that can give rise in a pretty stable way across the board to that introspective awareness, in the sense that we remember, that we could die today, we could die in the next hour, we could die by the end of the week. And so if we kind of keep that awareness in the back of the mind, he uses the analogy of observing like a hungry tiger in the forest when, previously we were maybe distracted by all of the natural beauty of the forest. We were kind of carefree. It was a, sunshiny, beautiful day. And then in front of us is this hungry tiger that's, kind of stalking toward us, and how in that moment we would become hyper vigilant and hyper focused and alert and aware of our breathing, our movements, all of the everything would slow down, and we would, be able to focus so clearly, and we'd have such a, you know, strong sense of urgency about that situation that we would forget about the beautiful surroundings and all of the things that had previously distracted us, and we would just be kind of dealing with this situation that's in front of us. He said, if we could see this, that our death is always, kind of right around the corner. He says we would always be mindful. We would have no problem concentrating, and all the Lamrim topics would not only make perfect sense, but would be our protection, not from death, but from a miserable death and a terrible rebirth, is the way that he phrased it. So, of course, we talked about the difference between a wisdom fear and a neurotic fear. A neurotic fear would be fear of death, but a wisdom fear would be fear of not being prepared for death. So he's saying how whether it's jealousy or maliciousness or ill will or covetousness or whatever's arising, if we can recollect impermanence and death, then we have that mindfulness, that introspective awareness that um, will help us to notice when we've moved into that afflicted state and see that there's the arising of delusion and move us back out of that more quickly. Um, and that it's equally useful, um, unlike practicing patience, as an antidote to anger, and practicing, um, rejoicing as an antidote to miserliness, then, um, those are specific antidotes. This is equally useful in triggering our introspective awareness. And then, on the basis of our introspective awareness, we would then apply, the specific antidote that for that arising of that delusion. But mindfulness of awareness and death can be what triggers our ability to become mindful of the arising of delusion, and then to apply the correct antidote to whatever the specific afflicted state is. He says, for Dharma practitioners with a strong fear of death, it is the opposite of the worldly person. He says, practicing Dharma is easy and spontaneous, and creating non-virtue is unthinkable. Whereas, a worldly person, they find it very difficult to maintain a practice, to start a practice. It seems like a great burden. Um, so, and he's saying what distinguishes those two in this respect is that wisdom fear of what happens next, where, am I creating the right causes and conditions to go through the death process protected by my practice, or am I not doing that? Any thoughts or questions? So then he gives us another level of advantage on day 96, where he's saying he's expanding on the role of, because we kind of just talked about it as they often talk about it as the um, kind of the fuel for our practice, kind of um, the thing that helps us to really get started, to get motivated. But here he's saying that um, our Dharma practice begins, and again, like I said, he says our Dharma practice begins when we see beyond the happiness of this life and start to prepare for our future lives. This is the path of the lower capable being and includes basic Lamrim meditations such as impermanence, lower realms, refuge, and karma. Um, Remembering impermanence and death is like the fuel that propels a rocket or the butter that burns in a butter lamp. Without the fuel, there can be no liftoff, and without the butter, there can be no light. But then he talks about, so of course that's what we're focused on right now in the Lamrim, is the role that impermanence plays in creating that reorientation to caring more about future lives than the happiness of this life. But he's saying that even once we've mastered the small scope and we become a practitioner um, practicing the middle scope, or we become a great scope practitioner, he's saying that he says there are still obstacles to our practice due to the ripening of negative karma, and our Dharma practice will still require effort. Um, and if we don't continue to be careful, we could lose our determination and lose our accomplishments. Um, and he says that is why remembering impermanence and death is vital even at these advanced stages. We still need the spur of knowing we may die at any moment to keep our practice strong. So, it isn't something that we just use for a certain amount of time and then stop thinking about it, or it doesn't have any um, ongoing benefit. He's saying even if you're a great scope practitioner and you've mastered, you've even developed renunciation, you still want to maintain a clear awareness that there's no certainty to your lifespan. And so um, because again, like we've said, we're talking about um, just day by day creating, kind of the way that I see it is, again, just like with health or anything else, all you can really do is wake up and recognize, okay, I woke up again, which is fantastic, and I may have all of today, and I may not, but you know, if I assume I have all of today, what do I do today um, to stay on the path? What do I do today to make sure I'm putting down the right seeds, the right karmic imprints, purifying, and so on? Um, and then that's what a life is just repeating that day over and over and over again. And then if you do that every day, your whole life is creating virtue, avoiding non-virtue, purifying existing non-virtue, doing all of the right things that we need to do. But we never, the utility of remembering that we can't postpone that process, that we can't wait until some perfect future time to get started and to, that never goes away. Doesn't matter how many of the realizations you've accomplished, you always want to have that drive, that determination to overcome hardship, overcome obstacles, and just continue to do the next step in the process. And because it's only the last bodhisattva ground is the path of no more learning. Up to that last path of the bodhisattva ground, you are learning, you are developing, you are laying down imprints and doing all of the things. So we're not on the path of no more learning, or not even on the first bodhisattva ground. And so it doesn't matter, where we think we are in terms of this meditation or that. We always have to, it's always beneficial to remember that the opportunity to lay down these imprints, to get these positive imprints is, potentially not going to be there tomorrow. And then day 97, he comes back, again to death and the role that living a life consistently remembering, because like we said, if it keeps you every single day making the right choices for that day, then you've done it. You've spent your whole life doing all of the right things, and then here and there making mistakes, but purifying those mistakes, not just regarding them as good or useful, or but actually recognizing what is a mistake, and then at least engaging in purification practice when mistakes do arise. So he's saying that the most advanced Dharma practitioners are able to experience their death in a joyful way, because they see that, could be because they are going to use the arising of the mind of clear light to either achieve enlightenment or get really, really profound benefits, karmic benefits. So they look forward to that as an incredible opportunity in that sense, or perhaps they recognize that there's benefit in appropriating more youthful aggregates, having, because at that time maybe they're 90 years old, and they can't travel as much, they can't travel, they can't do the same sorts of things. Like, if you look at His Holiness, the benefits still are incredibly profound, but things have shifted in terms of he doesn't fly around the world as much and so on. So they look forward to being able to do those sorts of things also. They look forward to having that kind of vigor and that kind of youthful energy, to be able to build monasteries and travel all around the world and do those sorts of things again. They did them, and then they had to stop doing them, and now they're thinking about, oh, I get to do that again, I get to go through that whole process again, that cycle of being able to benefit in that way. That's also available to me now. So that's a very joyful kind of way to think about it for them. And then he says, less accomplished practitioners are not necessarily overjoyed, but they're content. they're happy, they're comfortable, and they have a strong confidence that their rebirth will be um, beneficial. Um, and then even the least accomplished practitioners have no fears, have no worry at death. They're undisturbed at least. They go through death with a peaceful, equanimous mind without any kind of worry or fear, because they know. So maybe they're not blissed out, or they're not, but they're able to experience it with just a calm, even kind of mind. He says, imagine what it would be like to approach death with a great sense of spaciousness and peace. Imagine what the great meditators feel, that this is a happy transition, like going on a picnic, free from attachment. There are no problems weighing down the mind. There is no unfinished business, because we have done what we could with the best possible attitude, loving the people around us without attachment. We're leaving them with the best possible gifts, our love and our good death, and we know that they will be all right. Wouldn't that be a death to look forward to? Any thoughts or questions? Yes, Aaron, sorry.
So this passage kind of got me wondering on what is then what does it mean for a practitioner to interact with purification then? Like I know that's a daily practice, for example, but then should it be the center of our practice? Or what would it look like then?
I would say it's a critical part of a well-rounded practice. Um, I don't know, because, there's also meritorious activities where we're trying to lay down new karmic tendencies. Um, and then, of course, there's striving with regard to the Lamrim, trying to get Lamrim. I think probably, I don't know. Certainly, Lama Zopa puts great emphasis on Lamrim realizations as a focal point of practice. But it's also true that purification plays a role in our ability to achieve Lamrim realizations, because a mind that is more and more free from negative karmic potentials is a mind that finds it easier and easier to meditate, to achieve deeper states of concentration and realization. Um, so it's all kind of mutually supportive, in that sense. Um, but yeah, like you're saying, it is meant to be a daily practice. Um, and maybe even, twice a day, if the historical advice is to, if possible, to do 35 confession Buddha practice and Vajrasattva, daily. That's sort of the ideal, um, or, at least to include both when we can, maybe on the weekends, or when there's more time. Um, but I think it's all kind of mutually reinforcing. Certainly, they say that purification practice itself has the power to cut off the lower realms. Um, so even if a person did nothing else, a person could only do purification practice and get to a point where they've cut off the lower realms, which is quite beneficial. Um, so So in day 98, I mean, he's kind of been talking about the 9-point death meditation in various ways. But here he introduces it specifically and, by name, where he says the three most important points are that the certainty of death, the uncertainty at the of the time of death, and that at the time of death, nothing can benefit us aside from our spiritual practice, aside from the Dharma. Yeah. So yeah, he's just day 98. It's just basically saying that because those are the three root um, contemplations in the 9-point death meditation. So he's kind of just distilling this topic into it. The essence of it is to say that what we're really trying to internalize is that our death is definite, and the time of our death is completely indefinite, or you could say certain and uncertain. It's translated both ways. And then when we are experiencing our death, it is the practice that we've done, the habits, the virtuous tendencies, the purification, the familiarity that we have with emptiness, perhaps other things. Those are the things that, as the mind gets more subtle, and we stop being able to interact with the outside world, and then the mind ultimately exits the body and enters the intermediate state. um, it's all of our practice that will allow us to navigate that experience in the best possible way. That keeping those three things in mind is you could say, the essence of this topic. He says, and even if it is terrifying for us, we need the courage to face it the same way we need to face the pain of a surgeon's scalpel when we have a tumor that needs to be excised. The, the sharp cut of a death meditation now frees us from the horrible disease of the lower realms later. So again, that goes back to, kind of having a mature attitude. And, because it's also true that people um, turn away from getting treatment because they're afraid, like they feel a pain somewhere and they just sort of ignore it. They don't want to go. Almost like if the doctor doesn't tell them that they have cancer, then they don't really have cancer, and that it's the diagnosis that is the problem. And that's a silly way to think about it ultimately, but it's not uncommon. Um, it's like they can't bear going through receiving the diagnosis and then dealing with the treatment process, or the treatment might not be successful. But whatever's there is already there in the body, whether you acknowledge it or you don't acknowledge it, whether you try to do something about it or you don't try to do something about it. Um, it's the trying to do something about it that at least gives you the possibility of having it go better. If you do ignore it, then there's only disadvantage. There's only increased likelihood of it going really poorly. But just biting the bullet, as they say, and facing it head on, tackling it, coming up with a plan, um, and then doing your best to execute that plan, that will give you the greatest probability of likelihood of everything ending up going well. So, these meditations, he's saying that these meditations, they can be unpleasant. They can, and it's not the only one, that can be unpleasant. We're going to look at other ones that are also, like meditating on the suffering of the lower realms. That's also not so much fun. But he's saying we go through that, uncomfortable experience to get the kind of medicinal benefit of actually getting the result of reorienting ourselves. Just like when you take a driving class, in high school they show you, the films of the car crashes and the, those bodies in the street, and the whole like scared straight kind of, thing. It's kind of like that. It's unpleasant to think, but it's not. Again, nothing is being fabricated. Nothing is being just invented for the purpose of frightening. It's that these are genuine possibilities, and to avoid them, there are things that you can do. It's, it isn't that, it would be cruel to point that out if it was inevitable, if it was like, oh yeah, this terrible thing is definitely going to happen and there's nothing you can do. If the Buddha just pointed that out, that would be mean, and but that's not true. It's out of his compassion that he expressed, well, there's this that you want to develop some concern about, so that you do all of the things that allow that not to be your experience, that allow you to avoid that. And same thing, that's why we learn how to drive well, because if you don't, then it's, then really terrible consequences can flow from that choice. But if you make a different choice and you really apply yourself to starting out in the parking lot and then driving in safe, neighborhood streets, and and just gradually building up your capacity, then you can become a really safe, excellent driver, and the probability of anything terrible happening is extremely low. And the same thing is true of building up our knowledge and our wisdom, and the habits and the tendencies that keep us from experiencing the really negative consequences of harmful actions. Any thoughts or questions? So now he's going to go through in more detail those 3 points, those 3, that death is certain, the time of death is uncertain, and that at the time of death, everything, the only thing that protects us is our practice. He's going to give us a variety of things, individual contemplations that we can bring into that meditation, so that we approach it from different angles and really have a very full experience of those points. So day 99 starts with every being has to die. And he, gives us, in that contemplation, one of the instructions when you're engaging in that contemplation is to think about all of the incredibly accomplished people from the past who died. And the first example that he gives is also one of those, specific examples, but the Buddha, showed the aspect of passing away. So, even a wheel turning Buddha is going to show the aspect of passing away. Now, the death, that separation of body and mind doesn't hold any negative possibility, but still, it isn't that wheel turning Buddhas persist in the world forever. The karmic causes and conditions for them to arise fall away, and then they show that aspect. And so of course that's something to contemplate. You can also look at the founders of all of the other major religious traditions. They were also incredibly highly realized, highly accomplished, and yet they also passed away. You can look at, of course, people that were at the height of political power or military power, or um, titans of industry, and it didn't matter how much land or wealth or what kind of armies they commanded. They were powerless to avoid their own death, regardless of, they invented incredible things, or they wrote, extraordinary plays or treatises, or contributions in science or medicine or any field, and yet that had no impact on their ability to not pass away. And so we haven't done any of those things. We're completely ordinary. So if it doesn't matter how many billions of dollars or how much knowledge or how much incredible kind of world altering contributions you make, then certainly we have no hope of doing anything to prevent our death. So here it's kind of funny, because we talked about this. He says, reading the obituary column of a newspaper is a very good reminder of impermanence and death. He says, perhaps it should be renamed All the People Who Didn't Expect to Die Today But Did, because for most of the names, that is the situation. Reading a newspaper in this way becomes a complete course in impermanence and death. So, of course, he's not picking on these people, but he's saying that's true of every person. They're simply people who died, and this is true of every person, that no one, except for very highly experienced practitioners, no one really wakes up with a strong view that today will most likely be their last day, that they probably, and Lama Zopa actually encourages, because one softer way that you find of working with this in the texts and things is to think, well, I could die today, I might die today. Lama Zopa says, well, no, you should think I will die today. You should think that, I am going to die today. Because with that first example, the first way of working with it is good, but if every day we don't wake up with the idea that I will die today, then if we wake up with that, then we'll be right one of the days. Whereas if we don't wake up with that, we'll never be right. The idea that I might die today isn't ever really actually true. But the idea that I will die today, that is going to be true. It is true, but it's also because when you say I might, that implies I might not. And that can't be true every single day of your life, because on the last day of your life, it can't be that you might not die that day, because you will die that day. So if we can work with the contemplation, I will die today, then that's a contemplation that will actually come true. Um, and but you might I tried to work with this by changing my wallpaper on my because I'm on my computer every day, and so I put "I will die today" as the wallpaper on my computer, because I was like, I didn't have a printer. Like, I thought maybe I could print it and put it somewhere, but it seemed easier. And then my mom came over, and she saw the wallpaper, and she sat down, and she was like, I'm going to need you to explain to me why your wallpaper says "I will die today." So there's a skillful and an unskillful way of working with that. Don't freak out, other people, because I had to explain, and it was a long conversation. Um, so but it can be helpful, to have that contemplation. Any thoughts or questions? Yep, Aaron.
So why is it that the statement "I will die today" being true one day, why is that relevant compared to the statement "I will possibly die one day"? Like, I understand it might motivate us differently, but why does the truth of that statement matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of why I think you live that day differently. You try to maintain a sense of things being what if if you did know, if the doctor called you that morning and they said, you know for whatever reason we can tell, you definitely, like, you were poisoned, and we know how the poison's going to act, and um, there's nothing we can do. You have exactly, you know 14 hours left, and then that's it. um, that day would go differently, rather than, like, if they said, well, you know because it would just be a little bit different in terms of the way that you talk to people, the way that you kind of made things more order. You would keep your affairs in order. You would always be mindful about how you're interacting with your loved ones. You would make sure that there was nothing hanging over, you know, that your will was in order, and you were doing, and you would spend that day, you know, concentrating on your practice. And whereas if you give yourself kind of an out, then you're making more space for distraction to arise. um, if it's like, well, yeah, it could be, but because I think it's because also just the strength of the tendency that we're arguing against is so incredibly strong, and is so ingrained, the view of permanence that we've been talking about, that as a habit, as our present habit, is so deep in the mind, that we kind of need the strongest possible way of removing it. And that if we give it kind of any room, that false view of permanence is going to just have a really easy time of reasserting itself. Um, yeah. All right. So we are just out of time for today. Is there any final thoughts or questions? Oh, all right. So we'll dedicate. So recollect the motivation that we established and think that by having listened and participated, we've actualized that motivation, which has created positive energy in the mind. That positive energy will ripen in beneficial ways. So we cultivate a sense of letting that energy go and thinking strongly. May it ripen for the benefit of all sentient beings. So just try to very strongly visualize all of the incredibly vast, beneficial ways that you're dedicating that energy to ripen. All right. Well, have a good evening. Happy Losar. And yeah, see you guys. What's today? Thursday. See you guys on Monday.
Absolutely.